Scientists have shown us and told us and confirmed to us that the universe is billions of years old. Life generated from itself. Humans have lived on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years. Human civilization has been around for tens of thousands of years. We're told that Aborigines have lived in Australia for 40, 50, 60,000 years. And sadly, because Christians have accepted the secular worldview of the origin of the universe and the origin of mankind and the origin of the species, because we have surrendered these early chapters, we've got away from the truth. And the truth is, the first 11 chapters of Genesis forms an essential part of the Word of God. This is the Genesis of all things. The book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. As Christians, we should have complete confidence in these first 11 chapters of the Bible. These aren't an allegory. These aren't quaint little stories. We're looking at, this week, the Tower of Babel. This isn't some Hebrew myth account. This is historic narrative. This is the record God chose to have recorded for us by Moses, and it's 100% reliable, 100% accurate. And what these chapters of the Bible do is tell us we should not be listening to secular historians. When you hear that Aboriginals have lived here in Australia for tens of thousands of years, you should have confidence to know that that conflicts with the Bible. Therefore, it's wrong. Not what many Christians do and say the Bible conflicts with secular history, so therefore I'm dismissing the Bible. That's not the way that we should go about things. One thing we know as we read the biblical account, Christians argue about when creation occurred. When was creation? Well, I'm not that interested in any of the arguments. When I read the Bible, I read that God created the earth in 6 days. And when I read through the genealogies, I can have great confidence that that was somewhere around about 6,000 years ago. But it's actually more interesting than that, because about 4,500 years ago, God sent a great flood to destroy all of mankind, except Noah and his family, 8 that were on the ark. And all the cultures that we have around the world today are no older than 4,500 years. When you hear about this culture, the Chinese culture, the Egyptian culture building pyramids, and they built their pyramids and they've been around for thousands of years, it's not true. The secular historians and the archaeologists are using pseudoscience and guesswork to come up with dates that are wildly inaccurate and wildly unreliable. One thing we know is the Word of God is reliable in its accounts. I do wish there was some more detail, but God has chosen in his wisdom to use an economy of words in the way he has presented things. Before we start in Genesis 11, I just want to give some background, some important background to the story of Babel, by looking at Genesis 1, reading from verse 27. In Genesis 1, God has just created all of the universe, the earth, the animals, the plant life, and he's just created mankind on the 6th day. And he says in verse 27 of chapter 1, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" So after having just created this wonderful new world, he puts Adam and Eve and gives them a command to go out and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Fill this wonderful earth that I have created for you to inhabit. If we then skip over to chapter 9 of Genesis, after 1,500 years, that society that descended from Adam had corrupted itself to such an extent that God deemed that it was no longer viable and wiped it out. And during the flood process, he reshaped the face of the earth. effectively created a new earth for Adam and his family to inhabit and live in. And having recreated and reshaped a new earth after the catastrophe of the flood, God said to Noah and to his family in chapter 9 of Genesis, verse 1, "So God blessed Noah and his son, and he said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.'" What we have in Genesis 10, before we jump into 11, we have what is really an exercise in linguistic gymnastics. We have the record of the genealogy of Noah, Shem, Ham and Japheth and their descendants. And in verse 1 of chapter 10 we read this. Now this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and the sons were born to them after the flood. And what we have in Genesis 10 is a book of the Bible that most Christians just skip over. It's just a series of names. There's very little detail given of any of the people in this chapter, but there are some exceptions. We see in verse 6 the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put and Canaan. And that's typical of chapter 10 of Genesis. But in verse 8 we read this. Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty man on the earth, a mighty one on the earth. So we have Nimrod, and the description is given, he began to be a mighty one on the earth. And we see this beginnings of might, and I don't just think it's physical power, I think it's who he was as a man. He was a powerful figure. He was probably a person that resonated power and commanded respect. In verse 9 we read, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. This really jumps out of the pages of chapter 10 because no detail is given of most of the rest, but here there's an emphasis placed on Nimrod and how he began to become a mighty one on the earth and how he was a mighty hunter. And that mighty hunter, I don't think it's just simply that he was a mighty hunter of animals, but it's been speculated that he may well also have been a mighty hunter of men. Very little is known from the biblical source other than what we've read about Nimrod, but there is some interesting Jewish tradition, rabbinic teachings that give detail of Nimrod, and the suggestion in that Jewish tradition is he was a tyrant. Now, we can't have any confidence in that detail because it is just rabbinic tradition and it's oral Jewish tradition, but it seems to fit within the narrative here, a man who began to become a mighty one and a mighty hunter. Also, you've got to understand the times. Today, people live, if we're lucky, maybe to 100. If you look at the genealogies, if you look at contemporaries of Nimrod, Nimrod was a great-grandson of Noah. Noah himself lived 350 years after the flood. Shem, Noah's son, lived 500 years after the flood. Eber, who was probably born around the same time as Nimrod, lived for 464 years. So you would imagine and expect that Nimrod was one of these long-lived men, and here is a mighty and powerful man, a man who began to become a mighty one upon the earth, and a man who was a mighty hunter. It's quite plausible to imagine that that Jewish rabbinic oral tradition and teaching is quite likely the case, that Nimrod could well have been a great and powerful dictator, a great and powerful tyrant. What we do know, the Bible does give us a few more glimpses into Nimrod, because in verse 10 of chapter 10 it says, "And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel." What we have with Nimrod is a man who has a kingdom, a man who has authority and power. You don't have a kingdom without having authority and power, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. But it doesn't stop with Babel. Look at this. Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Shinar probably means two rivers, which locates this region of Shinar as between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. You'd think Nimrod would be happy with, a handful of cities that he's built like this, but it goes on. He doesn't just build those cities. From that land, he went to Assyria. He went to the neighbouring region, to Assyria, and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Resen, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. And just while we're in chapter 10, just one more verse I want to look at, verse 25. To Eber were born 2 sons. And if you ever wondered where the word Hebrew comes from, it actually comes from the man Eber. Eber had 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. What do we see in the next chapter in the story of Babel? We see the division of mankind and languages. Now let's read from chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and it stands to reason that that would be the case. Noah comes off the ark. He has 3 sons. They teach their grandchildren the language they speak. They teach their great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. And of course, Noah lives significantly into the lives of the stories of many of these people that we read about. Noah was definitely alive when the Tower of Babel was constructed and when God divided up the languages of the people. Noah was definitely alive. Shem was absolutely, certainly alive at this time. Perhaps if Nimrod was the terrible tyrant that was attempting to seize power and build his kingdom at that time, perhaps he'd sat on his grandfather's knee, grandfather Shem, as he told him about how God had destroyed the earth with a terrible flood. That's one of the interesting speculations about what the people may have been trying to do when they built this tower. They'd heard the stories, probably firsthand from Noah, Shem, Ham and Japheth, about how God had destroyed the wicked people. And one of the speculations why they might have built the tower was to give themselves a place of refuge in case God had attempted to send another great flood, perhaps to give themselves a place to flee to. Verse 2, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So they travelled east from Ararat, which is the place where the ark had landed. I also like to point out, just because we have a mountain in Turkey today that's called Ararat, that's not necessarily the Ararat upon which the ark landed. That may well be a later place that people renamed Ararat as they migrated to Turkey. Certainly they migrate east to the land of Shinar, which is the Mesopotamian valley that we know and hear about when we hear people talking about ancient, older history of mankind. And when they talk about the fertile Mesopotamian valley, and this is where modern people developed and came out of, the secular historians are quite right there, because Mesopotamia is exactly where these people go. It's called in the Bible the land of Shinar, though. Then they said to one another, maybe it's Nimrod, maybe the oral history of the Jews is right, maybe it's a group of them. It's unknown who. It's just they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone and they had asphalt for mortar. We do know that Nimrod was here, because this is the location from which his empire begins. If it wasn't just Nimrod, I strongly suspect he was certainly one of those who encouraged the people to do this thing. The other thing you've got to understand, to build a great building, effectively a great pyramid, to build this great pyramid, you need incredible man hours. Hundreds of thousands, millions of man hours. So you need an incredible drive to get this building constructed. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Now, nothing remains of the Tower of Babel. We don't know what it looked like. But what's interesting is what comes out of Babel. God scatters the people at Babel and they go out from there. We don't know what the tower looked like, but what do we see around the world? When the people scattered from Babel, they went to Egypt. And what did they build there? Cities, pyramids. You look across the Mesopotamian valley and there are ziggurats, which are pyramids, scattered all over the place. And in fact, when you look around the world, it's surprising how many ancient pyramids there are. If you go to Sudan, Nigeria, Greece, Spain, China, Mexico, Peru, India, Indonesia, Believe it or not, even the Native Americans in North America, they built pyramids. So where do you think they got this concept from? God scatters them from Babel, and the one thing that sticks in all of their minds, that great tower we built, that great structure we built. So though we don't know what the Tower of Babel looked like, the fact that all these people scattered, and where they scattered to, they built great ziggurats, great pyramids, strongly lead people to speculate this was probably some sort of pyramid structure. In fact, the inspiration for all the pyramids we see around the world. And it's fascinated some secular historians why these people from all these different parts of the world, why the people in Peru and the people in Spain and the people in Nigeria and the people in Africa and the people in China and India and Indonesia, why did they all build the same sort of structure? Because they all came from Babel. And secular historians, by dismissing the biblical account, the knowledge is lost to them. But the Lord came down to see the city, verse 5, and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they have one language. And this is what they will begin to do now. Nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. There's the statement of God. God had said to Noah, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And what did the people do? In rebellion against God, they come together in this fertile plain of Shinar, and they said, let's build a tower, let's build a great building, let's all come together and gather around and stay centred around. And we build this place, why? Lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. This statement is a statement of defiance, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth. We're not going to do what you said to do, God. And remember, Noah, Shem, Ham and Japheth are still alive at this time. They give first-hand testimony to these people, probably, that God said to go out and fill the earth, spread across the new earth. And they say, no, we're not going to do that. We know that's your will, God. We know that's what your instruction is. We refuse to do that. We're going to build this great tower in order that we not be scattered and be obedient to the voice of the Lord. Nothing much else is known about this tower that they built, but we do know a fair bit about lots of the pyramids that are around the world. And what we see in those pyramids around the world, some of them were edifices to the tyrants and the pharaohs and the rulers that ruled the people, and they just literally became the tomb of these men. But many of them are associated with all sorts of pagan idolatry and pagan worship. It's believed that the Andean pyramids built in South America, that's where they had human sacrifices. They killed people. The Bible doesn't enter into any commentary here, but it's quite possible that people took the practices from Babel and took it with them where they were. Perhaps this place was a centre of idolatry, opposition to God, false God worship. We just don't know. But when the Lord inspects the tower, he condemns it. In verse 6, God isn't worried about a challenge to his authority. It's not like his creation could rise up against him and he had anything to fear from the people. The issue was God realised by them gathering together in this city and building this structure and in behaving in such a disobedient way towards God, God realises that they are condemning themselves. And this city that they're forming, these large urban areas that they're forming, were places of great sin and great potential. God wanted them to spread out and enjoy his creation. So his assessment in verse 7, come, let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So we have the one true God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. This is one of the numerous places in the Old Testament where the triunity, God is one, but he's three. It comes out. Let us go down. God's talking Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Let us go down and confuse their language. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, or Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. So this is where all the various cultures that we see upon the earth This is where the beginnings of those cultures came from. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking Chinese or Australian Aborigine or American Indian or Scandinavian or Russian or various African cultures, they all come out of Babel and the scattering that occurred at Babel. And this identifies the origin of all the various human languages. Maybe not all the modern human languages. I think what you find is over time languages evolve naturally themselves, but all of the parent languages come from this event. And if you read this story and you didn't read any of the rest of the Bible, you would assume that Babel at this point is finished. Game over. God scattered them, he's destroyed their plans to build this tower. Surely that's the end of Babel. But the intriguing thing is Babel doesn't end with Genesis chapter 11. In fact, Babel, the word Babylon is derived from Babel. Babylon comes out of Babel, and this story from Genesis chapter 11. And I was interested to see how often Babylon came up in the Bible. And would it surprise you to know that the word Babel or Babylon comes up 274 times in the Bible? Babylon turns into all that is opposition to God, false religion and the like, coming out of the ruins of this ancient city at Babel and reforming in various shapes and forms. And a number of very powerful Babylonian empires arise, the chief of which was the Babylonian Empire of the 7th century, Babylon, which ultimately sacks Jerusalem and destroys the kingdom of Judah, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. I'll just do a few glimpses at some of the Babylonian mentions. In Isaiah chapter 13, Isaiah, the great prophet of God, gives a prophecy about Babylon. In the 13th chapter of Isaiah, he writes these words, "And Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited." So Isaiah gives this prophecy that just like Sodom and Gomorrah, which was destroyed completely and utterly to be forgotten and never known, or we don't even know the location of Sodom and Gomorrah, God says, "I'll do the same to Babylon." He makes this prophecy through Isaiah. It will never be inhabited. When we look at the Babylonian Empire, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and his successors, we would expect to see Isaiah's prophecy come true in that the end of the kingdom of Babylon was utter destruction and utter devastation, such that the kingdom and the city would never again be inhabited. But what in fact happens after Babylon falls to the Medes and Persians, the Medes and the Persians just take the city over and continue to govern the city. It doesn't fall in the way Isaiah describes. Jeremiah gives a similar prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 62. "Then you shall say, O Lord, you have spoken against this place to cut it off, so that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but it shall be desolate forever." Not even going to be an animal in this city. It's going to be wiped out. "Now it shall be, when you have finished reading this book, that you shall tie a stone to it and throw it out into the Euphrates. Then you shall say, thus Babylon shall sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary." Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. So you have two prophets of God giving a prophecy that this great kingdom will be destroyed completely and utterly and never be inhabited. And yet this didn't happen in history. Babylon continued to be a place well inhabited for many, many, many hundreds of years after the overthrow of Babylon. And some critics of the Bible have said, see, here's some prophecies of the Bible that have failed to come true. God said through Jeremiah and Isaiah they would be destroyed, never inhabited, and yet they continued to be inhabited for hundreds of years after this great kingdom of Babylon fell in the 6th century. Rather than the Bible being wrong, what we have here is two prophecies about the Babylon that will exist at the time of the end. Jeremiah and Isaiah weren't prophesying about Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. They were prophesying about the Babylon that lies in our future. And at the moment we look at Babylon and it's nothing more than a ruin. There's nothing there. There's no commerce. There's no trade. There's no people living there. It's not an empire. It's not a power base. But guess what? Interestingly enough, Babylon reappears in the biblical vernacular, and it's right at the end. Revelation chapter 17, we see Babylon appearing again. And I think what we have in this Babel concept is this concept of opposition against God, and it probably relates to satanic powers behind Babel and Babylon and the forces of the evil one who will revive this Babylonian power base. It was interesting actually reading about Saddam Hussein attempting to rebuild some of the ruins of Babylon. I found that very fascinating for eschatological reasons, because I personally believe what's going to happen during the Great Tribulation, when the Antichrist is revealed, I think he will be a centrepiece that especially the Muslim world will flock to. And I think they will flock en masse to him because within their own prophecies, they're expecting a great deliverer to come. And my reading of things is their prophecy of their coming Messiah seems to match the biblical description of the Antichrist. So Revelation 17 verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. So what happens is an angel comes and carries John away so that he may see this vision in the wilderness. And what does he see? John sees in this vision a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written. Surprise, surprise. What do we see? The name written. Mystery Babylon, the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. What we see is this spirit of Babylon revived in this woman, this mysterious woman who John has an insight into. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marvelled with great amazement. I think what the Antichrist is going to do in his kingdom and his rule, he's going to bring upon great wrath upon the earth, and there's great destruction. And Jesus describes the time that's recorded here in Revelation as the greatest tribulation in human history. We know there's been some terrible things that's happened in human history, so to think that this period is going to be the greatest period of human tribulation the earth has ever seen, and all of a sudden, mystery Babylon appears. It's the same Babel that we've just read about. It's the same name. It comes out of Babel. And in chapter 18, what we read about is the fulfillment of the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah. After these things, so God destroys Babel. It revives in the ancient Babylonian Empire, then the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then various other empires after that use Babylon as the source of power. And eventually it peters out. About 1,000 years ago, Babylon ceased to be a place, and you think it's finished. And just when you think it's finished, God tells us, no, it's not finished. Babylon is coming back. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. Now verse 2, and he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. So Babylon, which now doesn't exist, is in a very short period of time going to become a place of prominence, such that a mighty angel will turn up and call it Babylon the Great. And I think it's going to be the centre of the Antichrist world power. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. It's going to become the centre of world commerce. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive her plagues. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay to her double according to her works. Just skipping down to verse 8. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judges her. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and live luxurious with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city, Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. What's interesting, the way prophetic writing is in the Bible, it doesn't see the time gaps that we live in. For 1,000 years, Babylon's been nothing more than a ruin, and at best a place to go and visit to look at ancient, long dead civilizations. When we read the Bible and understand the Bible and take the Bible seriously, we understand that Babylon will revive. And I think the only way possible for it to revive, this is the centre of the Antichrist dominion, and in his final 3.5 years, I think it's going to be the source of world power. We read in the book of Revelation, no one upon the face of the earth will so much as be able to trade unless they had the mark of the beast on their right hand or their forehead. This is how in such a short time Babylon will go from a ruin, from a distant memory, from a story of an ancient tower that God destroyed and dispersed the people of the earth across the face of the earth, from seemingly nothing to this great power. And then finally at the end, prior to the second coming of Christ, what we'll see is the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah fulfilled. This city will be obliterated by the Almighty, never to be inhabited ever again.